The fluorescent lights hummed above my head as I sat in the activity room at Sunrise Meadows Nursing Home. They were showing us a movie from 1987. I'd already seen it twice that month. My name is Margaret, and I'm 74 years old, and I'm sitting in a room with 17 other people, most of whom don't remember watching this movie with me yesterday. The attendant, a young woman named Tasha with kind eyes and tired shoulders, squeezed my hand as she passed. "You doing okay, Miss Margaret?" she asked. I nodded and smiled because that's what you do when you're in a place like this. You smile so people don't worry about you. You pretend the fluorescent lights don't make you want to scream. You pretend that your own son doesn't come to visit less frequently than the doctor comes to check your blood pressure. It was a Tuesday when everything changed. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because my son, Christopher, finally called. He hadn't called in 43 days. I know because I'd been counting. I kept a small calendar in my room, and every night before bed, I'd mark off another day that had passed without hearing his voice. Silly maybe. But when you have nothing but time, you become very aware of how much time you have and how little of it is spent with the people who used to matter most to you. His voice sounded different. Tighter. The way it sounds when he's stressed about work or money or something he doesn't want to tell me about. "Hi, Mom," he said. Just those 2 words, but I could hear the entire weight of our estrangement in them. I could hear the guilt and the obligation and the part of him that still loved me even though he decided I was inconvenient. "Christopher," I said. I kept my voice soft, the way I'd learned to keep it. Gentle.
Non treatening.
The way you speak to someone you're trying not to scare away. "It's so good to hear from you.
How are you?
How's the family?" There was a long pause. The kind of pause that tells you someone is preparing to ask for something. That they're gathering their courage. That they're about to say something they know you won't want to hear. "Mom, I need to talk to you about something important," he said. I gripped the phone a little tighter. In my chest, I felt something shift. Not hope exactly, but a kind of anticipation. Maybe I thought he's finally coming to take me home. Maybe he's realized that putting me here was a mistake. Maybe he's understood that I'm not a burden. Maybe. But then he spoke. "I need your help with something. It's about the house. And I need you to sign some documents. My lawyer is saying that if you sign, it might help us keep it. Otherwise, we're going to lose everything." I didn't respond right away. I was busy processing what had just happened. My son, who had put me in this place 14 months ago. My son, who had visited me exactly 7 times in those 14 months. My son, who had finally called me because he needed something from me. He needed my signature. He needed my help.
He needed me.
But not in the way a son needs his mother. In the way a drowning person needs a life preserver. "Christopher," I said carefully, "what's happening with the house?" He explained it to me in language that was part legal jargon and part desperation. There were debts he hadn't told anyone about. A business venture that had failed. Investments that hadn't panned out. The bank was going to foreclose. But there was a legal maneuver they could try. Something about transferring assets to me, his mother, in order to protect them from creditors. Something that my signature would make possible. Something that would only work if I signed the papers. I sat there in the activity room at Sunrise Meadows, listening to my son explain how he needed to use me to save his life, and I felt something inside me break. Not violently. Not with anger or tears. It just broke quietly, the way old things break when you finally stop holding them together. "I'll do it," I said. "Really?" His voice brightened immediately. Like he'd already won. Like my agreement was all that mattered. Like he hadn't just called his mother for the first time in almost 50 days only because he needed something from her. "Yes," I said. "I'll sign whatever you need me to sign." After we hung up, I sat in that activity room while they showed the rest of the movie, and I thought about how I'd gotten here. How a woman who had spent her entire life taking care of people, who had raised a son and a daughter, who had worked for 42 years as a nurse, who had always been the strong one, the capable one, the one people came to when they needed help. How had that woman ended up in a place like this? The answer was simple and devastating. I got old. And when I got old, I became inconvenient. Christopher and his wife, Angela, had suggested the nursing home on a Tuesday afternoon, about 2 weeks after I'd had a small fall. I'd slipped on the kitchen tile at my house, the house where I'd lived for 47 years, where I'd raised my children, where I'd had Sunday dinners with my family. Nothing was broken. I was fine. The doctor had said I was fine. But Christopher looked at me with something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, and he said, "Mom, maybe it would be better if you were somewhere where you could be taken care of. Somewhere safe." What he meant was, somewhere I didn't have to think about you. Somewhere I didn't have to feel guilty about you living alone. Somewhere you could be managed and monitored and kept out of sight, so I don't have to actually deal with you. Angela had nodded in agreement. Angela had always made it clear that I was not her favorite person. She'd never said it directly. She was too polite for that. But I'd felt it in every family dinner where she'd exclude me from conversations, in every Christmas where she'd make sure to invite her own parents, but never quite made space for me, in every birthday where my gifts were purchased at the last minute with gift receipts included. I'd said I didn't want to go. I'd said I was fine living alone. I'd said I could take care of myself. But Christopher had looked so relieved when I'd expressed even a small amount of hesitation. He'd looked so eager to have an excuse to get me out of my own house. So, I'd stopped fighting. I'd let him win. And then I'd let him put me in here. The moving company came on a Friday. I watched them pack up my life. The photographs from decades of nursing, the quilts I'd made, the kitchen table where Christopher had done his homework, the bedroom where my husband had died 15 years earlier, the entire landscape of my memories, and I watched it all go into a storage unit somewhere while I moved into a room that was 8 feet by 10 feet with industrial carpeting and a window that faced the parking lot. Have you ever felt unwanted in your own family? Tap that heart symbol so I know I'm not alone. Because that's what I was. I was unwanted. My own son didn't want me. My daughter, Patricia, lived across the country and had her own life and her own family, and she'd called me exactly 3 times since I'd come here to check on me, but she'd never offered to have me come stay with her. And my grandchildren, the people I'd changed diapers for, the people I'd watched grow up, they didn't visit. They didn't call. They didn't send cards. They just forgot about me the way you forget about old furniture you've stored in an attic. Tasha found me crying in my room that night. She didn't say anything, just sat on the edge of my bed and held my hand while I cried. Tasha was one of the few people at Sunrise Meadows who seemed to actually see me. Most of the staff moved through the hallways like they were performing a job. But Tasha moved through like she was taking care of actual people. Like we mattered. He called. I told her. My son. He wants me to sign some papers to help him with his house. Tasha's expression changed. She didn't say anything, but I could see it on her face. She'd seen this before. Elderly people in nursing homes being called on suddenly to help with financial problems. The sudden interest. The sudden visibility. The sudden need. What are you going to do? She asked. I don't know, I said. He's my son. If he needs help, I help him. That's what mothers do. Tasha nodded, but I could see the worry in her eyes. She said, just make sure you understand what you're signing, okay? And maybe have someone look at it first. Someone who knows about legal things. But I wasn't going to do that. I was going to sign those papers the moment they arrived because my son had finally called me. My son had finally needed me. And even though I knew that need was selfish and temporary, even though I knew that the moment his legal problem was solved he would stop calling me again, I couldn't help myself. I would sign anything if it meant I mattered to him again. Even for just a moment. If this moment breaks your heart too, just hit like, so she knows she's not forgotten. Because that's the thing about being old and forgotten. You'd do almost anything to matter again. You'd compromise yourself. You'd ignore the warning signs. You'd convince yourself that you were helping when really you were just trying to buy a moment of connection with someone who didn't actually love you anymore. The documents arrived 3 days later. There was a cover letter from Christopher's lawyer, professional and formal, explaining in careful language what I was agreeing to. There were pages and pages of legal terms that I didn't fully understand. But I signed them anyway. I signed them in the activity room at Sunrise Meadows while watching a nature documentary about animals I would never see. I signed them knowing that I might be making a terrible mistake. I signed them because I was desperate. Christopher picked up the documents from the nursing home himself. This was the first time he'd visited in 6 weeks. He hugged me, but it was the kind of hug that people give when they're already thinking about leaving.
Quick. Distracted.
Like I was someone he had to check off a list. "Thank you, Mom," he said. "You have no idea what this means. This is going to save us." I wanted to ask him about his life. I want to know about his daughter's school grades, about his son's soccer team, about Angela and her new job. I wanted to know what he ate for breakfast and what he dreamed about at night, and if he ever thought about me when he wasn't about to lose his house. But I didn't ask any of that. Instead, I smiled and I said, "I'm glad I could help, sweetheart." He left, and I watched him drive away from the parking lot, and I realized that I'd just signed documents that I didn't fully understand, for reasons that I wasn't entirely sure about, with a pen that was probably a cheap one that the nursing home had provided. I'd done it because my son had asked me to, and because I was desperate to be useful to him again. It wasn't until a week later that the other resident, Mr. Peterson, who used to be a lawyer before he'd had a stroke, asked me what I'd signed. He read through the documents slowly, his eyes getting wider with each page. Finally, he looked at me and he said, "Margaret, do you understand what you've done?" I didn't answer him because I was beginning to suspect that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd been manipulated by my own son, that I'd been used in a way that I didn't yet fully comprehend. But what I knew for certain was that something had shifted. Something had changed. And what happened next would force me to finally understand exactly how much my son had taken from me, and exactly how much I was still willing to give. Sometimes silence hurts more than words. Comment true if you've ever felt that pain. Because the silence after I signed those papers was the loudest sound I'd ever heard.
And it was telling me something.
It was telling me that I had just walked into something I couldn't walk out of. That I had just given my son something that couldn't be taken back. That I had just discovered something about myself that I wasn't sure I was strong enough to face. Grandmas deserve love, not loneliness. Share this if you agree. Because I was about to find out that sometimes the greatest love a grandmother can give is the courage to say no. And I was about to discover that I'd never been taught how to do that. I'd never been shown that my own needs mattered. I'd never been given permission to protect myself. But I was about to learn all of that. And the lessons would change everything. I want to take you back to something. Back to a time when I still believed that if you raised your children right, if you showed up for them, if you sacrificed everything, they would remember. They would be grateful. They would love you in return. I want to show you the woman I was before I learned that sacrifice doesn't guarantee loyalty. It was 1998. Christopher was 28 years old, and he was getting married. His girlfriend, Angela, was beautiful in that way that some women are, the kind of beautiful that makes you understand why your son fell so quickly, so completely, so blindly. I remember the rehearsal dinner. I remember sitting at a table in the corner of a restaurant I couldn't quite afford, watching my son look at this woman like she'd invented the sun. I'd spent 40 years as a nurse. 40 years of night shifts and double shifts and shifts where I'd held patients' hands while they died, where I'd delivered babies in the middle of the night, where I'd shown up every single day even when I was tired and heartbroken and scared. My husband, Thomas, had been a carpenter. We'd built a life on his steady hands and my steady presence. We'd raised 2 children on a budget that required careful planning. We'd sent them to college through determination and sacrifice and the kind of financial aid that comes from being working class. But I'd done it. We'd done it. And I was so proud of my son. I was so proud that he'd gotten his degree, that he'd gotten a good job, that he was marrying this beautiful woman who came from a family with money, the kind of family that wore their wealth in the way they held their silverware at dinner. At the rehearsal dinner, Angela's mother had looked at me across the table and said, very casually, "Your dress is lovely. It must have taken you a while to find something that fit so well." What she meant was, I noticed that you're not like us. I noticed that you're wearing something that probably came from a clearance rack. I noticed that you're trying, and it's touching, but you still don't quite belong here. I smiled and I said thank you, and I didn't let her see that she'd hurt me. The wedding was beautiful. I wore my dress that Angela's mother had noticed, And I stood in the church, and I watched my son marry this woman, and I cried the happy tears that mothers cry. I didn't know then that I was watching the day my son would start to become someone else. Someone who would slowly, imperceptibly, begin to see me the way Angela saw me. As someone from a different world. Someone less than. Someone who didn't quite belong. In the beginning, it wasn't obvious. Christopher still called me every Sunday. He still came to dinner on holidays. We still had a relationship that looked, from the outside, like a son and a mother who loved each other. But there were small moments, tiny cracks that appeared and then were carefully hidden over again. Like the day I offered to help them with the down payment on their house. Thomas had been sick by then, really sick, the kind of sick that meant our savings were being drained by medical bills, but I had a little bit set aside. Not much, but something. I offered it to Christopher. I told him I wanted to help, that I wanted to do for him what my parents had tried to do for me.
He cried.
He actually cried, and he held me and he said, "Mom, I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the best mother in the world." And for a moment I felt seen. I felt valued. I felt like my sacrifice meant something. A week later, Angela called me and said they decided to go with a different financing plan. They didn't need my money after all. Christopher hadn't told me himself. His wife had called to tell me. And I understood, in that moment, that Angela didn't want me to have any claim on their house. She didn't want to owe me anything. She wanted me to be what I was quickly becoming, a woman they could accept help from, but never quite accept as part of their family. After Thomas died, the distance grew wider. I remember the funeral. I remember standing at his grave and feeling like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. He'd been my partner for 44 years. He'd been the person who understood me. And suddenly, I was alone in a way that I'd never been alone before. Christopher and Patricia both came to the funeral, but their visits felt obligatory. They sat in my living room, and they looked uncomfortable, like they weren't sure what they were supposed to do with a grief-stricken mother. Angela brought a casserole that she'd clearly bought from a restaurant because the pasta was too perfect and the sauce too uniform to be homemade. She put it in my refrigerator without saying anything, and then she looked around my kitchen like she was calculating its square footage and deciding it wasn't worth very much. After they left, I sat in my living room in the silence of my grief, and I realized that I'd raised a son who didn't know how to sit with pain, who didn't know how to just be present with someone who was suffering, who'd learned from somewhere that sadness was inconvenient. If you've ever given everything to your family and still felt invisible, tap heart symbol, so I know you exist. Because that's what I was becoming. I was becoming invisible. And the worst part was that I was becoming invisible to the people who loved me. Not because they were cruel, but because I'd spent my entire life being the strong one. The one who showed up. The one who took care of everyone else. And now, when I needed someone to show up for me, no one knew how to do it. Patricia called me from California about 3 weeks after the funeral. She was crying, which was unusual for her. She said, "Mom, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you why I left. Why I moved so far away that coming home to visit is almost impossible." I listened to my daughter explain that she'd left because Christopher had always been the favorite. That growing up, she'd watched me pour everything into my son, and she'd realized that no matter what she did, no matter what achievements she had, she would never matter quite as much as her brother. She said she'd left to prove that she didn't need us, that she could build a life where she mattered, where she was valued. I cried when she said this. Not because she was wrong, but because she was right. I had given more to Christopher. Not because I loved him more, but because he'd asked for more. He'd been needier, more fragile. And I'd poured myself into fixing that fragility, never realizing that I was also building a wall between myself and my daughter. "I'm sorry," I told Patricia. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know I was making you feel that way." "I know," she said. "That's the thing, Mom. You didn't know. You were so focused on taking care of everyone that you didn't notice you were hurting someone else in the process." After she hung up, I sat in my kitchen and I thought about my life. I thought about all the ways I'd given and given and given, and how it had never been enough to make anyone stay. I thought about how love, which I believed was the most powerful force in the world, had turned out to be something that could be taken and taken and taken and still leave you empty. 3 years after Thomas died, Christopher came to me and said he thought I should think about what would happen if I got sick. He said they'd heard about a really nice nursing home. He said it would be good for me to be somewhere that could take care of me if I needed it. He said it very gently, very carefully, like he was doing me a favor. What he was really saying was, I'm tired of having to worry about you. I'm tired of being responsible for my aging mother. I want you somewhere that the state will pay for, somewhere that professional caregivers will handle, somewhere that isn't my house.
But I didn't hear it that way. Not then.
I heard it as concern. I heard it as love. I heard it as my son still thinking about my well-being, even though I now understand that he was really just thinking about how to remove himself from the equation. Angela had nodded in agreement when he'd said this. I'd seen it in her face, relief. Pure, undisguised relief that her husband was finally going to do what she'd wanted all along. That he was finally going to put his inconvenient mother somewhere else. But I didn't say no. I didn't say that I was fine. I didn't say that I could take care of myself. I did what I'd always done. I accepted what they wanted, and I made it easy for them. I agreed to go visit a few places. I agreed to start thinking about it. I agreed to my own invisibility. Then, about 6 months before the fall that would change everything, something happened that I didn't understand at the time. Christopher called me very late one night. It was after midnight, and he was drunk. I could hear it in his voice. He said, Mom, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry that I'm not a good son. I'm sorry that you're alone, and I'm not there. I stayed on the phone with him while he cried. I didn't ask him what was wrong. I didn't ask him why he was calling in the middle of the night with this sudden honesty. I just listened, and I thought, this is my son. This is the person I love most in the world. And I can feel him slipping away from me, and I don't know how to hold on. After he hung up, I realized something.
I realized that he was scared of something.
That something was happening in his life that was making him question everything. That his sudden interest in putting me in a nursing home might not have been about concern for my safety at all. It might have been about something else entirely. But I didn't know what it was.
And I didn't know how to ask.
Sometimes the ones we love most are the ones who break us. Comment true if you understand that pain. Because I was broken, but I didn't know it yet. I was broken, and I was still trying to be strong. I was broken, and I was still trying to take care of everyone else. I was broken, and I was still saying yes to things that hurt me because saying yes meant my son might remember that he loved me. A week after that drunk phone call, I was at my neighbor's house. Her name was Ruth, and she was one of the few people who still checked on me. Ruth was 81 years old, and she'd been married for 58 years to the same man. She'd raised 4 children. She'd had a life that was full in ways that mine was becoming emptier. We were drinking tea in her kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd helped her daughter give birth during a snowstorm 30 years ago, where I'd held her hand when her husband had a heart attack, where I'd been present for all of her life's important moments, and Ruth said something to me that I've never forgotten. Margaret, she said, I'm watching you disappear. I'm watching you fade. And it's breaking my heart because I remember when you were so full of life, when you had so much to give. And I'm watching you give and give and give, and everyone around you is just taking. I told her she was wrong. I told her my family loved me. I told her that Christopher was a good son, that he was just busy, that he was just trying to figure out his own life. I defended him, even as I was beginning to suspect that Ruth was seeing something true that I was too scared to acknowledge. I know you believe that, Ruth said quietly. But watch closely, Margaret. Watch how they treat you when they need something. Watch how quickly they forget you when they don't. It wasn't until after I'd signed those papers for Christopher that Ruth's words came back to me. It wasn't until after I'd put my signature on documents I didn't understand that I realized what she'd been trying to tell me. That I'd been slowly, carefully, systematically abandoned. That I'd been putting myself in a nursing home long before I actually moved there, by making myself smaller and smaller and smaller. One afternoon, about a week after Mr. Peterson had told me I might have made a terrible mistake, I was in the activity room when I overheard 2 staff members talking. They were outside the door, clearly not realizing I could hear them. One of them said, "Did you hear about Margaret? Her son's financial situation? Apparently, he transferred a lot of property to her name to protect it from his creditors." The other staff member said, "Wait, so when the nursing home has to sue for unpaid bills, the money would come from her assets?" The first one said, "Exactly. The son is apparently pretty clever. He got his mother to sign papers that make him look better to the courts while also making sure his own assets are protected." I sat very still in that activity room. I sat very still, and I understood, for the first time, that my son hadn't needed my signature to help himself. He'd used my signature to help himself. He'd manipulated me. He'd used the one thing that still connected us, my desire to be useful to him, my desire to matter to him, to solve his own problems. No mother deserves to be forgotten. Share this if you still believe love is stronger than greed. Because I was beginning to understand that maybe love wasn't stronger than greed. Maybe love was fragile. Maybe love could be broken down and manipulated and used against you, especially if it was the kind of love that didn't know how to say no. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed at Sunrise Meadows and I thought about everything. I thought about the nursing home staff member's words. I thought about Mr. Peterson's concerned expression. I thought about the drunk phone call from my son in the middle of the night. I thought about Angela's perfectly calculated meals and her perfectly calculated indifference. I thought about all the ways I'd been used, and I realized something that broke me in a way that losing Thomas hadn't broken me. I realized that I was going to have to do something. I was going to have to take action. I was going to have to become someone I'd never been before, someone who fights back. Someone who doesn't just accept what's done to her. Someone who speaks up. But I didn't know if I had it in me. I didn't know if this old body, this tired mind, this broken heart still had the strength to do what needed to be done. I didn't know if I could face my son and tell him that I knew what he'd done. I didn't know if I could survive the confrontation that was going to come. Have you ever cried alone so no one could see? Just hit like, I'll understand. Because that's what I did that night. I cried alone in my room at the nursing home while the fluorescent lights hummed above my head, and I mourned the son I thought I had. I mourned the family I thought we were. I mourned the love I thought was unconditional, but turned out to have conditions after all. And somewhere in that grief, a small spark began to form. A spark of something that felt like anger, but also felt like clarity. A spark that whispered to me, "You've been invisible for too long. You've made yourself small for too long. You've accepted being less than for too long." And tomorrow, that spark would become a flame. The lawyer's office was cold. That's the first thing I noticed. Not the mahogany desk or the degrees on the wall, or the way the afternoon light came through the windows at an angle that made everything look like it was in a photograph. Just the cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and reminds you that you're somewhere important, somewhere permanent, somewhere that holds the weight of decisions made and truths finally spoken. I sat across from the lawyer, Margaret Chen, a woman in her 50s with eyes that had seen every version of human betrayal and greed. Next to me was Ruth, my neighbor, who'd insisted on coming with me when I'd called her and asked if she thought I should get legal help understanding the documents I'd signed. Ruth had said, "Margaret, call a lawyer today. Don't wait." So I did. And now I was sitting in this cold office, holding a folder that contained my son's manipulation made official through legal language. Margaret Chen looked at me over her glasses and said, "Do you understand what you've done, Mrs. Patterson?" I didn't answer right away. I was still trying to understand it myself. Ruth reached over and squeezed my hand, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. "Walk me through it," I said quietly. Margaret Chen opened the documents and began to speak in that careful, measured way that lawyers speak when they're about to tell you something terrible. Your son transferred multiple properties to your name, not because he wanted you to own them, but because doing so makes those properties invisible to his creditors. If they come after him for his debts, they can't touch the properties because they're in your name, not his. But here's the complication, and this is why your signature was so important. When the nursing home eventually files a claim against you for unpaid bills, or if there's ever any legal action taken against you, the creditors will see those properties. and they'll seize them to cover those bills or any claims against you. So, I said slowly, I've signed documents that put property in my name, but I don't actually have ownership of it. I just have liability. Exactly, Margaretchen said. Your son has essentially used you as a legal shield. He put millions of dollars in assets into your name to protect them from his creditors. And if anything ever happens, if you ever need to file bankruptcy, or if the nursing home takes legal action against you, those assets will be seized to cover your debts. But I didn't even know I was doing that. I whispered. I know, Margaretchen said. And in her eyes, I could see that she understood. She'd seen this before. She'd seen children do terrible things to their parents in the name of financial necessity. I felt Ruth's hand squeeze mine again, and I started to cry.
Not loud, violent crying.
Just quiet tears that fell down my face while I sat in that cold office and finally understood the full extent of what my son had done to me. Can we contact him? Margaretchen asked. I'd like to ask him directly what he was thinking when he had you sign these documents. He's at home, Ruth said. I can call him and ask him to come here. Tell him his mother needs to see him. Christopher arrived 40 minutes later. He walked into the office and saw me, and for a moment, his face showed relief. Like he thought this meeting was about something else entirely. Like he thought I was here to help him with more paperwork, more signatures, more ways to use his mother for his own benefit. Then he saw Margaretchen, and his face changed. Christopher Patterson? Margaretchen said.
I'm Margaret Chen.
I'm your mother's attorney.
Please sit down.
We need to talk about these documents you asked her to sign. Christopher looked at me, and I watched the calculation happen in his eyes. I watched him deciding what to say, how to defend himself, how to spin this narrative so that he didn't look like the person he actually is. My mother agreed to help me, he said carefully. I explained the situation, and she said yes. She wanted to help. Under false pretenses, Margaretchen said. Did you explain to your mother that by putting those properties in her name, you were making her liable for your debts? Did you explain that if the nursing home ever filed a claim against her, she could lose everything? Did you explain that you were essentially using her as a legal shield while leaving her vulnerable to financial ruin? Christopher didn't answer. You didn't explain that, Margaretchen continued, because you didn't want her to understand. You wanted her to sign something she didn't understand, and you were counting on the fact that your mother would be too grateful for your attention, too eager to matter to you, too desperate to be useful to you, to ask the right questions. I watched my son's face as this truth was spoken aloud. I watched him struggle with the reality of what he'd done. And then I watched him do what he'd always done when confronted with uncomfortable truths. I watched him deflect. My mother is 74 years old, he said. She's in a nursing home. She should be thinking about leaving her affairs in order, not about protecting me financially. This is just a way to make sure that when she passes, there's something left for her grandchildren. This is about legacy. Have you ever spoken the truth and still been blamed? Tap heart symbol if that pain feels familiar. Because that's what he was doing right now. He was reframing his own greed as concern for my well-being. He was turning his manipulation into something that sounded noble. I stood up. My legs were shaking, but I stood up anyway. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, this man I'd loved more than I'd loved myself, this man who'd reduced me to a legal tool for his own benefit, and I said, Christopher, I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. He looked at me, and I could see the fear in his eyes.
Good.
He should be afraid. Why did you put me in the nursing home? I asked quietly. Mom, we've talked about this. We thought it was best for you. You needed care. You needed. No, I said. That's not the truth. Tell me the real reason. Christopher looked away. Was it because Angela wanted you to? I asked. Was it because I was inconvenient? Was it because you couldn't handle having your aging mother around while you were dealing with your financial problems? Was it because putting me away made your life easier? He didn't answer, but his silence was answer enough. I know what you did, I continued. I know that you were already in financial trouble when you decided to put me in that nursing home. I know that you used my mental state as an excuse to get me out of my house, into a facility where I would be compliant and dependent and easier to manipulate. I know that you waited until I was isolated and vulnerable before you asked me to sign those documents. And I want to know, Christopher, how you could do that to your own mother? Christopher's face had gone pale. He said, Mom, you don't understand the situation I was in. I was desperate. I was losing everything. So you used me, I said. That's what you're telling me. Your mother, who spent 40 years nursing other people's children so you could go to college. Your mother, who offered you her savings for your down payment. Your mother, who showed up for every important moment of your life. You put her in a nursing home, and you used her as a legal shield to save your own skin.